Yesterday, the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, decided to remove the US from the Paris Climate Agreement, something that was agreed to by basically every country on Earth except for Syria and Nicaragua. Syria in war and Nicaragua because they didn't think it went far enough. Now, this just baffles me. I'm trying to understand the reasons for why you would do this, why withdraw from this agreement, but none of the stated reasons make any sense to me. So in this video, I'm going to break down the top 5 bad reasons I've heard why the US is withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. Okay, number 1 is because it is bad for the US economy. The US set a target of reducing their emissions from 2005 levels by 26 to 28% by 2025. And they've already reduced the emissions by around 12 to 14%. So maybe it's fair enough to say if you wanted to implement some really strict policies and really curb emissions, there might be a way to do harm to the economy in the process. But here's the thing, the Paris Agreement is completely non-binding. So if the president didn't want to implement any policies to curb emissions, that would be fine. And he's not going to be president in 2025 anyway, so I mean, what does it matter? This is a non-binding agreement. There are no repercussions. No one has to do anything. It's mainly just a goal. It's a target. That target in itself is not going to harm the US economy. And all of this ignores the fact that the world is moving towards cleaner, greener tech innovation. There's going to be a lot of investment in that area, estimates of multiple trillions of dollars being invested in this. So if you're a country that doesn't embrace reductions in emissions, then actually you might miss out on investment opportunities, new innovations, and you might lose the opportunity to be a world leader, and that might actually hurt the GDP. And if you look at the Canadian province of British Columbia, for example, they implemented a carbon tax and reduced per capita fossil fuel use by about 20% compared to the rest of Canada. Meanwhile, their GDP grew at the same rate as the rest of the country. So there isn't a lot of evidence to suggest that reducing emissions directly causes a downturn in the economy. Which brings us to number 2. Well, the free market should decide what technologies take off, what innovations happen. The money, the smart money, should go where the good investment opportunities are. The government shouldn't be deciding who should win and who should lose and that we should change to a cleaner, greener economy. That is a very American viewpoint on the world, and I like it. I like this idea that markets are smart and they'll put money where it pays returns. The problem is this market has never been fair. And the reason why is because CO2 has not been considered really a pollutant up until now. And to be fair, CO2 doesn't really seem like a pollutant. And if you're just emitting a little bit of it, there's no problem. The problem comes when we totally change the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And only then, because CO2 has this effect of trapping infrared radiation, something scientists figured out, more than 100 years ago. So here's the problem. People have been emitting CO2, which in small amounts is really not a big deal, but in large amounts can cause some damage. Damage in the form of more intense storms and droughts, and people have to pay for that. So there is a cost actually associated with emitting CO2. Except right now that cost is not being borne by the emitters of CO2, it's being borne by the whole world. And that makes the markets not on a level playing field. I mean, the analogy for this would be, let's say there's one company that disposes of its pollution appropriately and that costs some money. And so paying this company is more expensive than paying another company which just dumps its pollution in a river and, leaves the rest of the communities downstream to deal with it. In that market, it's not fair because people will go to the cheaper option and they're only cheaper because they're polluting for free. So, in order for free markets to decide and make a fair decision, all I'm saying is we need to factor in the cost of the pollution. This makes cleaner technology way more competitive. And so yeah, let's go for a free market solution, but let's make sure the market is truly fair first. Number 3, China and India don't have to reduce their emissions. So why should the United States? Okay, well, the truth about this is that China and India are setting targets under the Paris Agreement to reduce their emissions, but that is per unit of GDP, with the idea that these countries are still developing, they're still going to grow a lot, and so it seems pretty unfair to curb their emissions so strictly right now, whereas the US is the biggest historic emitter of carbon dioxide. They've emitted about 30% of the total excess carbon dioxide that is now in the atmosphere. Europe's also emitted about 30%. And that has made those countries very rich and very capable of changing their economies into less polluting economies. So the idea here is that what seems most fair is for the countries that contributed most to the problem to start to take action first, and also because their economies can deal with it, they're rich enough, and also the economies of the US and Europe don't depend very much on just a lot of energy. I mean, a lot of the sectors like, financial and technology and innovation, they don't require tons of energy to get going, not like building the infrastructure in India and China are going to require in order to lift all of those populations out of poverty. So I think it seems pretty fair for the US and Europe to go first. I don't think this is a part where you point to a country that hasn't really contributed much to the problem and say, well, why aren't they changing first before we do it? If you created the problem, you need to be one of the first to try to fix it. Number 4, the Paris Agreement wouldn't do anything to help climate change anyway. Now, while it's true that under the current emissions targets that have been set, we're not guaranteed to limit warming to under 2 degrees Celsius, which is what most experts think is kind of a safe level. But it is an important starting point. It is all the countries of the world virtually coming together to agree to do something. And I think once people start taking action to try to achieve these goals, we're going to find that it just gets easier to try to lower our emissions. So I think the Paris Agreement is really a floor, not a ceiling on what we can do in terms of reducing our emissions. And it's really an important first step. And I don't see how anything is gained by leaving it. Number 5, he had to withdraw from the Paris Agreement because it's politically unpopular here in the US. Well, that is actually just not true. Depending on what poll you look at, roughly 7 out of 10 Americans think that we should still be in the agreement, and 60% of swing voters think that it's good to be part of the deal, and even half of Republicans wanted to stay in. So what really is gained here? I think there's certainly a portion of Trump's base that wanted to see him withdraw from this agreement. It's something he can point to as a campaign pledge that's been fulfilled, and it'll definitely energize that base. But beyond that, it's hard to see how this is going to raise his approval ratings much, which currently sit around 39%. And that brings me to bonus reason number 6, which perhaps is the real reason that he did this, and it was to piss off the opposition. He wanted a whole bunch of environmentalists whipped into a frenzy so that he could point at them and say, look how crazy these people are, and how much they prefer the trees and birds and stuff like that over jobs in the economy and things that people really should care about. The problem is, that relies on people believing that, these sorts of agreements would be bad for the economy, which I think you can demonstrate from the evidence that they're not. So I think the best response to this decision is not to get angry or inflamed or go nuts about it, because I think that's kind of maybe why he did it in the first place. I think the best reaction is one that we're already seeing, that people around the US, cities, states, leaders, business leaders, are all agreeing to work with each other to make sure that the US meets its responsibilities under the Paris Climate Agreement, whether the federal government actually signs it, ratifies it, or not. And I think that might be the best outcome here. If Trump becomes marginalized and people no longer look to his leadership, that might just make him feel small, which is probably the thing he would hate the most.